They say pain either breaks you or makes you create. For Paul McCartney, it did both. How does a kid from post-war Liverpool grow up to become one of the most influential musicians in history? How does a teenager who lost his mother channel that grief into melodies that would heal millions? This is the untold story of Paul McCartney, the boy who loved music, the man who transformed global culture, and the legend who never stopped reinventing himself. Paul McCartney was born in 1942 in Liverpool, England, a city still recovering from the trauma of World War II. His family wasn't wealthy. His dad, Jim, was a cotton salesman and part-time jazz musician. His mom, Mary, worked as a nurse and midwife. They were working class, but they were grounded in love, music, and modest values. When Paul was a child, the McCartneys didn't even have a record player, but they had a piano. And on that piano, young Paul began experimenting with sound, pressing keys until they became chords, and chords that became early echoes of genius. But it wasn't just music shaping him. At the age of 14, Paul experienced a loss that would define his emotional landscape for decades to come. His mother died from breast cancer. It was sudden, traumatic, and life-altering. She was the glue of the household. Her death created a silence Paul didn't know how to fill. Years later, he would describe it as a deep emotional hole that never fully healed. But it did something else too. It planted a seed. They met at a church fair, of all places. Two teenage boys, both still raw from losing their mothers, standing in a sea of bicycles, parishioners, and local chatter. It was July 6, 1957. John Lennon was on stage with his skiffle group, the Quarrymen. Paul McCartney was in the crowd watching, not just the performance, but the possibility, and something clicked. What followed wasn't instant fame. It was a slow, often messy collision of two creative forces, John with his rebellious streak and biting wit, Paul with his melodic intuition and relentless optimism. Paul was only 15, but he could tune a guitar properly and play Little Richard covers note for note. That alone made him valuable, but it was his hunger, his near-obsessive need to create, that drew Lennon in. They began writing songs together in notebooks and on bus rides, sometimes in each other's bedrooms, scrawling lyrics while lying on twin beds in post-war council houses. They weren't thinking about hits. They were just trying to impress each other. And that tension, trying to outwrite, outsing, outshine the other, became their engine. It was a partnership of paradoxes. Lennon brought the edge, the cynicism, the poetry of pain. McCartney brought the structure, the sweetness, the emotional layering. Together they formed a duality that became the gold standard for songwriting, Lennon-McCartney, a credit line that would go on to shape the sound of the 20th century. The early Beatles were raw. They played dive bars in Hamburg, Germany, performing for hours each night in smoke-filled clubs, sharpening their chops through sheer exhaustion. By the time they returned to Liverpool, they weren't just good, they were undeniable. And when Brian Epstein took notice, he didn't just see a talented band, he saw a phenomenon waiting to be unleashed. But even then, no one could have predicted what would happen next. From the outside, it looked like the Beatles had everything. #1 hits, sold-out shows, spiritual awakenings in India, psychedelic revolutions. They weren't just riding the wave of culture, they were the wave. But behind the scenes, something was unraveling, quietly, then all at once. By 1968, the camaraderie that had once fueled Lennon and McCartney's brilliance was beginning to crack. The creative partnership that gave birth to All My Loving, She Loves You, and Hey Jude had turned competitive, even cold. John was diving deeper into experimental music and political activism with Yoko Ono by his side, while Paul was desperate to hold the group together, musically and personally. Recording sessions for the White Album were tense. Members came and went from the studio on their own schedules. George Harrison, once the quiet one, was becoming increasingly frustrated with his limited creative input. Ringo even walked out at one point, temporarily quitting the band during the White Album sessions. It was no longer a brotherhood, it was a business under pressure. Then came the death of Brian Epstein in 1967, the Beatles' longtime manager, and the man they often referred to as the fifth Beatle. His passing left a vacuum none of them could fill. Without his steady hand managing their chaos, they drifted. Paul stepped in, trying to guide the group, but it only deepened the fractures. What he saw as leadership, the others saw as control. By the time they began filming Let It Be, the project that was supposed to bring them back to their roots, the cameras captured more than just music. They captured tension, silence, side glances. John zoned out. George argued. Paul, often isolated at the piano, was left trying to keep the creative flame alive in a room filled with smoke. And yet, even as the ship was sinking, they gave the world Abbey Road, a miracle of an album, polished, poetic, and bittersweet. The closing track, The End, features the now legendary lyric, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." At the time, fans had no idea it was their swan song, but inside the band, everyone knew. By 1970, the breakup was public. Legal documents were signed, headlines screamed, fans mourned, and Paul, he was devastated, not just emotionally, but existentially. His identity had been intertwined with the Beatles since he was 15. Who was he now? When Paul walked away from the Beatles, he wasn't just leaving a band. He was stepping out of the shadow of a phenomenon. And for the first time in over a decade, there was no Lennon to harmonize with, no Ringo backbeat to lean on, no George to balance the egos, just Paul and silence. That silence, however, didn't last long. In 1971, almost quietly, he did something both bold and unthinkable. He formed a new band, Wings. But this wasn't just another musical project. Wings was a rebellion against the critics who wrote him off, against the myth that he was only 1/4 of a once great machine. And most daring of all, he put his wife Linda at the keyboard. Now, Linda McCartney wasn't a trained musician. In fact, her earliest performances with Wings were rocky, and music journalists didn't hesitate to remind the world of that. She was an outsider in a business obsessed with technical perfection. But Paul didn't care about that. What he cared about was chemistry, trust, heart, and he believed no one brought that to the stage more honestly than Linda. Their early years in Wings were far from glamorous. The band toured in a van. They played unannounced shows at small universities, often to half-full auditoriums. And McCartney, who could have filled stadiums just by playing Beatles hits, refused to coast on nostalgia. He wanted to build something new, from the ground up, and it worked. Within a few short years, Wings went from being an underdog project to one of the most successful acts of the 1970s. Albums like Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, and Wings at the Speed of Sound spawned hits that defined a decade. Songs like Jet, Silly Love Songs, and Live and Let Die proved that McCartney hadn't lost his edge. He had just recalibrated it. But the real story wasn't just the chart-topping success. It was how Paul found his voice again, through Linda's unwavering belief in him, through starting over without the cushion of Beatlemania, through allowing himself to fail in front of the world and still keep moving. Their love wasn't flashy, but it was fierce. Whether they were on stage in Tokyo or on their farm in Scotland, they were partners in every sense of the word, raising children, writing music, building a private life amidst global fame. Paul would later say that he and Linda were never apart for more than a week during their entire marriage. In an industry notorious for broken relationships and public betrayals, Paul and Linda chose something rare: stillness, stability, a shared world away from the noise. And in that world, McCartney rediscovered the part of himself that fame had nearly erased, the joy of making music for himself, not for the machine. But life didn't stop testing him. In 1998, Linda died from breast cancer, the same disease that had taken Paul's mother decades earlier. History, it seemed, was cruelly repeating itself. Paul was devastated. He later said he didn't know how to carry on, but somehow he did, through songwriting, through his children, through keeping Linda's memory alive. He remarried, though the relationship was rocky, and then eventually found love again with Nancy Shevell, whom he married in 2011. Through it all, Paul remained grounded, still writing, still performing, still showing up for his family, his fans, and his music. Paul's legacy isn't just in his discography, it's in his compassion. He's donated millions to cancer research, animal rights causes, and education. A longtime vegetarian, he's advocated for environmental sustainability and ethical food choices. He supported war veterans, indigenous communities, and disaster relief efforts. But he doesn't do it for headlines. He does it because he believes in humanity. He believes in connection. Today, Paul McCartney is in his 80s. He's performed at the Super Bowl. He's been knighted by the Queen. He's played to millions of people across decades, and yet he still walks on stage with the same spark he had in the Cavern Club back in Liverpool. His songwriting credits now number in the thousands. His influence stretches across every genre, and his songs continue to be covered, sampled, and celebrated across the globe. But perhaps the most remarkable thing, he still cares about the music, about the message, about the people. Paul McCartney isn't just a music legend. He's living proof that even the deepest grief can become art, that even after the biggest fall you can rise again, that love, legacy, and authenticity are far more powerful than fame. He once said, "In the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." And Paul, he's made a lot of love, in melodies, in memories, in moments we'll never forget. So the next time you listen to a Beatles track, or sing along to Let It Be, or hear the opening notes of Blackbird, remember the man behind the music, the boy who lost his mother, the friend who lost a band, the husband who lost his wife, and the artist who never stopped believing in the healing power of a song. If this story inspired you even just a little, don't forget to give this video a like, hit subscribe for more powerful life stories. And hey, share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the hardest moments can lead to the most beautiful music.